So welcome to the second day of the 13th edition of our meeting of studies on the origins of contemporary philosophy. Today we have the honor to hear a presentation by Professor Thomas Uebel, who is professor at the University of Manchester, and following it, Professor Marcos Silva, who is professor at the University of Pernambuco, will make some comments on it. So, Professor Thomas Uebel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Do we have the PowerPoint, please? So we can, okay, right. The next slide, please. Thank you. So let me begin with thanks to Bruno Poli and Professor Porter for this return invitation to the meeting of studies of the origins of contemporary philosophy. 5 years ago, I had the pleasure of talking here about Schlick's ill-fated theory of affirmations and his attempt to emulate ideas of the middle Wittgenstein, and I much profited from the discussions we had here, as you can see from the published version. So I hope in a way you can set me right on the paper I'm presenting to you today, because as is my wont, I'm flying a kite here, and I'd be very interesting to see what you make of it. So, and in fact, I'll come back, as is also my habit, to the Vienna Circle. And in order to get to the point quickly, I will focus less on certain theoretical difficulties or interpretive puzzles, but on a certain application and on the practical consequences of the contentious unity of science thesis. I think this application of the unity of science thesis of the Vienna Circle has not yet been paid the attention it deserves. While theirs was, as we shall see, well, their application was highly specific to their time and place, the principle behind it, I think, has a much wider application in our postmodern age of post-truth politics. So much by way of first introduction. We can begin to see what it's all about by calling to mind the Vienna Circle's unofficial manifesto of 1929, Scientific World Conception, the Vienna Circle, which was collectively authored by Rudolf Carnap and Otto Neurath with help from their colleagues. And there it was clearly, they clearly stated an epistemological principle that informed their anti-metaphysical conception of unified science. Could we have the next slide, please? They say intuition, which is especially emphasized by metaphysicians as a source of knowledge, is not rejected as such by the scientific world conception. However, it requires that all intuitive knowledge claims are followed by a rational justification step by step. Any method may be used by those who search, but what has been found must stand up to testing. The view that attributes to intuition a superior and far more penetrating power of knowing, which is capable of leading beyond the contents of sense experience, which must not be confined by the shackles of conceptual thought. Important, not to be confined by the shackles of conceptual thought. This view is rejected. Now, clearly, this rejection has implications for social science exceptionalism, that is, for the view or the attempt to separate the social sciences from natural sciences and assign to them a different sort of knowing. The principle that is announced here by Carnap and Neurath seems clear enough. If social scientific statements are testable, at least in principle, then they are candidates for inclusion in unified science. Otherwise, they are not. Surprisingly enough, as it happens, elsewhere in the manifesto, the threat of turning empirical social science into metaphysics by making its claims untestable was somewhat underestimated. But even 2 years later, it was no longer. In a short publicity piece for the Vienna Circle's Philosophy in the Monist, Neurath stressed in sociology, that's a second quote here, in sociology also the physicalists find it necessary to oppose transcendental metaphysical entities. At times, Neurath, of course, sounded, as some of you who will have read some Neurath know, at times Neurath sounded as if he rejected all interpretive methodologies, and this was something his opponents focused upon. But it turns out that Neurath only rejected a certain conception of the understanding said to distinguish the social sciences, only a certain conception of Verstehen, precisely the one that turned the still fledgling sciences into metaphysics, into statements beyond testability. So we have here a quotation at the bottom of the screen from Empirical Sociology. Neurath says, when the concept of Verstehen is analyzed scientifically, then everything about it that can be communicated in words to someone else turns out to be a statement about structure, just as in the natural sciences. So very important, and I have a whole paper about this, but I can't go into the details for it now. Neurath and his co-authors, they did not deny at all that there is interpretive work to be done in history and social science. But what Neurath stressed is that this work is far more prosaic than is often advertised, and that it does not support the extravagant claims that have been made for it. So Neurath in particular, and he was a trained historian, so he used it then, Neurath in particular accepted what we can call everyday hermeneutics as a matter of course. Other aspects of Neurath and the Vienna Circle's anti-exceptionalism also contradict the picture that exceptionalists paint of their opposition, as we'll see presently. To be sure, there we can get, as we see, a certain agreement between the exceptionalists and the non-exceptionalists, but it comes to nothing because the anti-exceptionalists also make demands that many exceptionalists will not accept. So what I'll do in what follows now is I'll give you first a brief run through of what I call Vienna Circle anti-exceptionalism, namely in a nutshell, what Neurath's non-reductive naturalism was about. Then I will briefly look at what the debates about exceptionalism were about, or where they show a certain surplus, which we can ask, well, what is it? Is it really philosophical, or what is it all about? And I shall suggest that really the surplus there is of a political nature. And after that, I shall go in with you, or lead you, or we can all go together into the trenches. Namely, we can see Neurath in the trenches against German social metaphysics, and we will see what he's really arguing, what he's really using the unity of science thesis for, or rather against. And then we'll ask, well, this is all very nice, but is there a general argument? And I hope to be able to convince you that they have one. Okay, so going on to Neurath's non-reductive naturalism. Could we start on the next slide, please? Thank you very much. So concerning exceptionalism, these discussions have two moving parts. There are different conceptions of what it is that the social sciences say are to be accepted from or not accepted from. And then there are different conceptions of what it is that that they are to be accepted, that is to be accepted, namely what the social sciences kind of are. So, and both exceptionalists and anti-exceptionalists have really different conceptions of each. Let's start with what the social sciences were to be exempted from. For Dilthey and Windelband and Rickert, the contrast class to the human sciences was natural science with exceptionless universal laws. So they thought, well, if this is what the social sciences have to be in order to fit with you, the unified science people's view, this doesn't work. And therefore, because we cannot find exceptionalist universal laws in the social sciences, well, the unified science view is out. And in a way, this criticism on part of Dilthey, Windelband, and Rickert, and of course there's differences between them, but I shall abstain, retreat from them now. This criticism fits, of course, the standard view of the logical empiricist unified science as a pyramid of reductively related sciences with physics as its foundation, right? So you have physics at the bottom, and then comes chemistry, and then comes biology, and then comes psychology, and then maybe sociology, and if we are lucky, we have economics, etc., etc. In fact, the kind of reductive pyramid that still in 1958 we find Oppenheim and the young Hilary Putnam promoting as the unified science view. But that was not Neurath's view. Neurath's view of the unified science was entirely different. He talked of it as an encyclopedic view, and for him, what mattered is that statements in all the sciences must be intersubjectively testable in principle, and these statements from different sciences must be combinable with statements from other sciences so as to derive predictions about complex phenomena. And one of his favorite examples was everything of a forest fire. And so in order to deal with a forest fire, we have to call upon the findings of all sorts of different sciences, from meteorology to etc., etc. So the point that the unity of science had for Neurath then was not the eliminative reducibility of the individual sciences and bringing them down to one basic line in physics, but their connectability. And so not invariably is it the case that the sciences, those sciences that are part of unified science, that they use universal laws and always speak of repeatable events, but they can also allow what Merton later on called mid-range generalizations, and typically too they can allow singular causal explanations. So Neurath's view of unified science was thus a fairly, shall we say, liberal one. Can we have the next slide, please? So that was what, as it were, how Neurath thought of the sort of social science, what it is to be what they were exempted from. Dilthey and different conception of what it was that was to be exempted. Well, Dilthey, Windelband, Rickert, and they are the standard opponents, regarded the Geistes- and Kulturwissenschaften to be highly specific to individual cases of agencies and meaning. And moreover, they considered them weighted with values in ways that was utterly unknown to the natural sciences. Again, very sharply, they said, well, look, Windelband and Rickert talked of nomothetic versus ideographic sciences. So the natural sciences were always talking about general things and generalizations, whereas the Kulturwissenschaften, that was a term Windelband and Rickert used, they were concerned with individuals and the meaning of individual events, and values. Well, that's what made them valuable to us. That's why we looked into them. Similarly, Dilthey, who used the term Geisteswissenschaften, and of course, particularly this value dimension was unknown to the natural sciences, and therein lay a clear contrast to how the logical empiricists' conception of mind and social life was supposed to be. But there too, one has to note that at least Neurath's conception was by no means as reductive as it has often been assumed to be. Physicalism, for example, of which Neurath was a big proponent, physicalism was not logical behaviorism, but it ultimately meant simply something like reasons can be taken as causes. If one looks at it very closely, and I think one can does that best with looking at Carnap, and I have a paper in Philosopher's Imprint late last year, which looks at that in detail, which argues that in fact logical behaviorism, that is to view them as logical behaviorism is a misinterpretation. The behavior's descriptions that were thought to be correlated with mental state descriptions, they are instead treated as fallible indicators. They're inductively arrived at. They're fallible indicators of mental states. So the point, again, was not reduction of mental states to behavioral dispositions, but rather the point was to ensure the intersubjective testability of mental state ascriptions. So in sum, the unity of science in the hands of Neurath and Carnap as well left all the room needed for the disciplinary variety of cognitive and social psychology, sociology and anthropology, economics of different varieties, even of history. So numerous aspects of this, shall we say, non-reductive conception of unity of science were not yet worked out at the time. I mean, nowadays we have non-reductive naturalism that uses obviously the notion of supervenience and variable realization. These were concepts that Neurath and Carnap did not have available at the time, but if one looks closely at what they say about individual sciences and how they work, it's quite clear that they aimed in this direction, and that current forms of social scientific methodological naturalism stand in this tradition. So next slide, please. If we accept this, so I know this is a big if perhaps, but if I can just ask you to join me in this and sort of say, okay, let's grant Uebel that, you know, Neurath was a hip character and he didn't do this reductionism, etc., etc., etc. Okay. What follows? What follows from this? What follows particularly from this from this corrected picture of the early 20th century anti-exceptionalists, the logical empiricists? And one might say, well, there's one conclusion that's obvious, but that's, as it were, all too easy because it misleads. Because one might say the following: one might say exceptionalism presupposes methodological monism on part of the sciences that the human sciences seek exemption from. However, given methodological pluralism on part of unified science, which I've just argued Neurath and Carnap proposed, this motivation for exceptionalism, namely to escape the oppressive monism of natural scientificism, that motivation for exceptionalism becomes OTOs. So one might say, ultimately, all the debate was, well, pointless, in vain, had they only understood each other. But that would be a wrong conclusion, because the agreement that was reached here by this agreement on methodological pluralism is merely partial, because exceptionalists hold out against the naturalistic demand that the social sciences be explanatory, while anti-exceptionalists will not accept that the pluralism of scientific methods includes wholly non-explanatory understandings. So, in other words, the anti-exceptionalists, so Neurath, Carnap, they say, okay, there is a great pluralism of scientific method, but what they all do is they have an explanatory office. What they rejected, in other words, to use the slogan which Dilthey used, they rejected the idea of a sharp division between explanation and understanding. So we have still then a very deep division between exceptionalists and anti-exceptionalists. Exceptionalists claim that the anti-exceptionalists sacrifice what exceptionalists deem essential about the human sciences in order to include them in their unified science, whereas anti-exceptionalists require exceptionalists to rein in their philosophical, or what they would have called metaphysical, ambition. Next slide, please. So, nevertheless, one might wonder, well, isn't there something more? I mean, the exceptionalists typically sort of claim that they have a deep philosophical point to make about saying, look, the human sciences, we can use that term, the human sciences are utterly different from the natural sciences. And why? Well, and that's why hermeneutics is altogether different. And that's the point they make there seems to be more than just that it's a sort of a methodological difference. And what is it then? And well, when we look at particularly, and here again, I must ask you to bear in mind that I'm thinking of I'm here speaking of the opposition of the Vienna Circle exceptionalists, their opposition in the 1920s and 30s. They held very strong views as to, well, what shall we say? What in their day was called conceptions of man, and what nowadays, being slightly more enlightened, we call conceptions of being human, and what it takes to think about being human. So, in other words, conceptions of human nature and human distinctiveness. Now, given that these conceptions change, we may note they change across history. We may, of course, wonder whether the exceptionalism issue has remained the same across the whole stretch of history where we can see it. In fact, this points us, and I'll come back to that to the end. This points us to the fact that really it's not exactly the same debate. People were not always arguing about the very same point when they argued about the exceptionalism of the human sciences from the 19th century to the now 21st. And so that's one point. But another point to note is when we look at this surplus of the exceptionalism debates, is that that these conceptions of being human reflect the social nature of human beings, and reflecting the social nature of human beings, it's clear that they have a certain political dimension. And if that is so, then it follows that given that the determinative politics are typically local, that investigation of the different instances of the exceptionalism dispute will be highly specific. And well, these are some general ruminations here, but I think they certainly hold here, because the concepts and contrasts that the discussion of one instance of that type of debate requires may not readily transfer to the discussion of another instance, and that's precisely, I think, what we find here, and that's perhaps precisely why it has often been overlooked what the specific nature of the Vienna Circle's position in those debates was. Can I have the next slide, please? Hello, Bruno. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, thank you. Okay, nope. Yep. So, nope. Previously. Thank you. Right. So then the question is, what do we do now? How do we investigate the politics of the conception of being human that was prevalent in the 1920s and 30s in Austria and Germany? I think in general, it's not very helpful to assign positions uniformly or that we assign philosophical positions uniformly to political positions, or that it would be particularly helpful to use a blanket kind of base superstructure schema. I think across history we find that representatives of both exceptionalism and anti-exceptionalism they come in all different political colors. So when I now suggest that to investigate a little bit the political overtones, the political dimensions of this exceptionalism debate, I will understand political in a broad sense, in a rather very broad epistemological setting. Namely, I will look at first how knowledge claims are considered to be legitimated or delegitimated by contestants. And secondly, I'll pay attention to who is and who is not included among those held competent to judge the knowledge claims and questions. So applied to claims about the social world, this focus promises to open for inspection a range of applications in which the conceptions at issue can be characterized on a continuum that ranges from, broadly speaking, democratic to authoritarian. Okay, so with this, let's go then into the trenches of the Neurath's opposition. Next slide, please. Let's begin with a little thesis, namely the Vienna Circle anti-exceptionalists knew that they were engaged in a philosophical and political struggle. As an example, I shall use Neurath's argument in his book of 1931 against the Geisteswissenschaftliche Soziologie of Werner Sombart, of Ottmar Spann, and of Max Scheler. For Sombart, there existed Werner Sombart. Briefly, Werner Sombart was a very prominent German social scientist. He was of the generation of Max Weber. In fact, he can be found on the side of Max Weber in the debates about Werturteile, about value judgments in social science, and Sombart himself was an economist, but unfortunately he drifted ever more to the right, and while he already had well, the long and short of it is he became a happy companion of the National Socialists in the 1930s, and already his books about capitalism in the 1920s had distinct sort of anti-Semitic overtones. Ottmar Spann was an Austrian sociologist who had a Ganzheitstheorie, a very holistic theory, which, however, was not so much holistic as in an epistemological sense, as an idea that it was really an idea that society is best understood as a functional organism in which sort of different social classes are assigned different roles, and that only operates best in this fashion. And the other one, Max Scheler, of course, a prominent phenomenologist who in the 1920s became one of the pioneers of the sociology of knowledge, albeit a very philosophical, one might even say metaphysical sociology of knowledge. So let's look at what Neurath had said to say about each of these guys and why he thought it was really beyond the pale what they were proposing. So to begin with Sombart, and Sombart 1924 there, that's a little anthology he produced of different readings from different sociologies of his day. And in the introduction, Sombart introduces the field of sociology, etc., etc. So he introduces, for him, there exist two conceptions of scientific sociology. First, what he calls eine seelwissenschaftliche, so a psychological sociology, and secondly, a geistwissenschaftliche, or what he calls noological sociology. Term is from Eucken. It means something to do with noesis and that kind of stuff. Now, this psychological, according to Sombart, this psychological sociology reduces social life and history to law-governed consequences of natural, scientifically understood psychologically facts, aiming at universal generalization, while the noological or the geisteswissenschaftliche Soziologie, well, that recognizes the autonomy of the social as a domain of Geist, of spirit, and it focuses only on particular manifestations. So we can see here already this echo between an echo of the distinction between generalizing and idiographic sort of in the investigations. Moreover, but this is where it becomes particularly interesting, moreover, for Sombart, those two types of sociology can be characterized further as either Western sociology, namely this supposedly law-governed consequences of natural scientifically understood psychological effects, or the second one, this noological sociology, that Sombart called, this is a purified form of German, particularly German sociology. And according to this German sociology, the principle there was, as he put it, quote, spirit cannot be reduced to mind and human culture cannot be derived from elementary psychological drives. So that's our next slide, please. And he goes on to characterize the type of knowledge that this quote unquote German sociology gives you as follows. He says, true knowledge only reaches so far as we are able to understand, verstehen. It is limited to the realm of culture and fails in the natural sciences. Naturally, however, the understanding is different for both of these approaches to sociology. In one case, it is psychological, on the other, it is noological. Psychological verstehen means the understanding of minds and depends on empathy with the psychological processes of others. Noological verstehen means the understanding of spirit and is equivalent to understanding sense and meaning. So, why at first we might say, he understands here between causal and understanding sense and meaning. I see, that's quite good. But nevertheless, what Sombart is pointing to is something more than just a pronouncedly, shall we say, hermeneutic understanding of what sociology does. Because, as he says, while Western sociology aims for causal, psychologically based laws, German sociology seeks to uncover what he calls the immanent lawfulness of the realms of the spirit, and to show, moreover, their importance, namely the lawfulness of the realms of spirit, show their importance for the realization of spirit in history. And I think you will probably agree that with this, we go way beyond Dilthey, and we go back to the parts of Ranke that never quite made it into history as a science. Okay, so that's Sombart. Can we have the next slide, please? Neurath, when he relates Sombart's view, he does not as yet criticize this cult of Deutschtum, but he only noted the general closeness between modern German academic sociology and theology. Nevertheless, typically he understood Neurath had long understood, and took it to be understood by everybody else as well, that theology had an ideological social function. In fact, on this point, Carnap fully agreed with him, who wrote in 1934, metaphysical philosophy and metaphysical religious dogma can be investigated by sociologists and psychologists for what their conditions and consequences are. One finds that they represent wishful dreams and the like, the systematic promotion and dissemination of which in social struggles serves purposes of distraction and obfuscation. And so this is mild Rudolf Carnap putting his foot down for once. So in this analysis, he assigns an objective social function to such beliefs to certain beliefs about how social life is to be ordered, that is obscured by a legitimating ideology. And Neurath similarly can be found to say similar things. He says, in general, the representatives of metaphysically oriented sociology are also representatives of the existing order. So both Carnap here and particularly Neurath kind of says, look, what we have here is a pretty obscure conception, metaphysical conception of the point of social science revealing spirit in history, and what there is more to it that may very well this obfuscation obviously is meant to detract our attention from what we might say is really going on. Next slide, please. The same ideological function is in focus in Neurath's criticism of Spann's holistic Gesellschaftslehre, according to which society is a whole in itself and in all of its form, and that its wholeness or totality, quote, is reality not because it is a causal consequence of the action of its part, but because it is a true whole. Now, if you can understand that, you're doing better than I don't really know what he's on, but a whole for Spann is a whole because that's what it is, and it cannot be explained any further. These are, as it were, the givens of this spiritual realm that is to be explored. And thus, he says, by his own admission, Spann kind of wrote, this totality or wholeness, quote, can never be grasped by hands nor seen with outer eyes. Composure and depth of spirit are necessary in order to behold it with the inner eye. So, well, how, needless to say, a verificationist will not look at this with with great pleasure. Likewise, Neurath criticized Scheler, his vehement rejection of talk of social groups as, quote, only the sum of single economic subjects, unquote, namely as groupings without recognition of their reality as wholes, without a special spirit or will or soul, which truly collective persons, be they church, nations, states, cultures, undoubtedly process. So that's quoted by Neurath from one of Scheler's papers. Next slide, please. So Scheler's assertion that religious theological thinking and knowledge, metaphysical thinking and knowledge, and positive thinking and knowledge are not historical phases of the development of knowledge, but essential and lasting operations of mind and forms of knowledge due to the nature of the human spirit itself. None of them can ever replace or represent the others. That, I think, was pretty unable to detract from the epistemic deficit of his position. What deficit? Well, clothed in metaphysical assertions, these conceptions of society put forward by the exceptionalist at issue here, namely Sombart, Scheler, and Spann, they were clearly immune to empirical refutation. Now, you might say, of course, well, they were unable to gain empirical support, but that they were never meant to exhibit. Instead, it seems plausible to say that what these pronouncements were used for were they were presented as insights that were gained from a higher plane by deeper thinkers who saw further than merely the sensible reality to which we ordinary mortals are exposed. Next slide, please. And here, the point of the logical empiricist objections to the metaphysical distortions of the methodology and the philosophy of social science comes into clear view. I think they objected because because they denied people the cognitive autonomy that ever since Kant, and we know the logical empiricists were not the greatest fans of Kant, but I think in this particular respect, they had no quarrel with Kant at all. They objected to these social metaphysics because they denied people the cognitive autonomy that was was regarded as one of the defining features that the Enlightenment recognized as something that is owed to each and every individual. Metaphysics, understood as discourse beyond intersubjective accountability, held people in epistemic dependency. That was the view of Carnap and Neurath. And social metaphysics in particular helped to keep him in social bondage. Thus, Neurath wrote in one of the in the unpublished first version of empirical sociology, he says the scientific world conception, that was their view for their own conception, makes it more difficult for the ruling classes to align the broad masses with themselves by means of notions like fatherland, nation, religion, ideas. Once these concepts diminish in public prominence, it becomes increasingly clear that human groups stand in relations to others according to how they engage themselves for the standard of living and the general order of life. Next slide, please. So I noted earlier that Sombart had this very strange, as it were, turn of phrase. Namely, he talked of German sociology as opposed to Western sociology. Well, Neurath did not overlook this peculiar distinction of Sombart's, and in fact, by 1935, he also had a term for it. Nowadays, when we talk of these strange distinctions like Sombart's and stuff, we talk of, ever since Hermann Lübbe and a book of his from the 1960s, we speak of a thing called Deutschtumsmetaphysik. The translation for that would, I suppose, be the metaphysics of Germanness or something. This term, as I said, was coined in the 60s, and Hermann Lübbe used it to designate by it certain philosophical expectations that were prompted by the excessive nationalism that was professed by German philosophers during World War I. The German philosophers were, of course, not the only ones who were excessively nationalistic in their philosophy in World War I, but there's something, we'll stick with them here. I mean, Duhem also, even Dewey produced something like that, but none of that, I would suggest, goes to the lengths of quite the Deutschtumsmetaphysik. what is this? Here, what does it mean anyway? Well, the metaphysics at issue can be defined as understanding the empirically given characteristics of a people, here the Germans, not as contingent or historically developed ones, but as expressions of the very essence of that people. And of the sins covered by this kind of essentialism, one is particularly relevant to the issue that occupies us here, namely the exceptionalism with regard to social science on the part of these Austro-German theorists. And that sin was the view that the German mind was peculiarly different from that of its neighbors and particularly attuned to the depths of human, that is, historical being, depths that a merely empirical research could not possibly reach. Now, this, as it were, specialness of the German mind. I mean, some people have that it's particularly something, you may have heard about it, that some people thought the Germans were particularly metaphysical, etc. Well, that's another version of that. But at this, one might have thought, well, look, this is just this stressing this feature of the German mind simply excels a difference between between nations. And we might point to the beginning of Dilthey's introduction to the human sciences, where that point is already made as distinctive of German thought about social matters, distinct from that of the Western nations who have been affected by utilitarian enlightenment, etc. But that, with Dilthey, it's still fairly harmless. By the time the 20th century came around, this idea of the specialness of the German mind was transformed into an ideology of the supremacy of the German Geist, a supposed depth of feeling and appreciation of metaphysical realities that simply escaped the notice of the more superficial and utilitarian peoples of Western Europe, let alone the quote-unquote non-Aryan ethnicities that else might be kind of thought of. And all this, I think, fits Sombart very nicely. So next slide, please. So I said Neurath did not miss this bit of Sombart. He did not use the term that Silva used, but his term was Blubo Metaphysik. Now, what's Blubo Metaphysik? Blubo is a shortening of the expression Blut und Boden, and that, of course, was a standard expression of Nazi discourse. In that ideology, Blut und Boden constituted the final court of appeal of all völkisch and racist reasonings. It designated the irrational ground of all claims made by and on behalf of Nazi authorities and their followers, especially those pertaining to claims of racial differences and differentiation up to supremacy. Neurath gave no specific examples when he used the terms, and he did that. He used those terms in correspondence with Carnap when he complained about some fellow theorists. But so he gave no particular examples, but he did mention Windelband and Rickert, two prominent neo-Kantian exceptionalists who sought to wed the categorical distinction between the sciences to a metaphysical value theory that happily exercised an ideologically even staatstragende, even function for the German Reich, a function that supported the political edifice sort of ideologically. So significantly enough, Neurath did not mention Dilthey in this context, and elsewhere, indeed, he appreciated that Dilthey tried but didn't quite manage to avoid metaphysics, and he differentiated Dilthey's own work as a historian from what later people made of his work. So Neurath can be pretty crude, but every now and again he knew when to draw distinctions, and it wasn't Dilthey here. It was particularly the 20th century sort of exceptionalists that he had in his ken. Next slide, please. Neurath had been long familiar with Rickert and his conception. In fact, his early mentor, Ferdinand Tönnies, engaged in a quite drawn-out polemic with Rickert in the early years of the 20th century, partly about the question of exceptionalism or other. And so Neurath knew what Rickert had about. For Rickert, values and our shared relation to them were constitutive for ideographic social science. And these values, moreover, stood in not further defined relations, but nevertheless, he insisted, stood in definite relations to absolutely valid values. So at that point, we leave it to Rickert to do whatever Rickert does there. But you can see the trend, the tendency Rickert's thoughts sort of went into. What's important is, for our purposes, is that Neurath noted what those values became. Early on, Rickert's constitutive values were religion, the church, the law, the state, customs, morals, science, language, literature, art, the economy, and all the technical means required for it. But by 1932, they also included the Volk, literally meaning the people. The term by that time carried a special meaning of racial homogeneity, right? And in that same book of 1932, Rickert, Rickert then sort of proclaimed that among the universe of values which give meaning and significance to life, he distinguished those possessing intrinsic value, Eigenwert, from those which only possessed instrumental or conditional value, Bedingungswert, and listed as examples of the former, namely those intrinsic values, science, art, family, Volk, the law, the state, etc., and on the latter, vitality, economy, technology, etc. Next slide, please. And then he added, human life that gains its significance exclusively from conditional values can only count as meaningful and valuable in a conditional sense, while he stressed that the Eigenwerte include these intrinsic value, include those whose value reality lies beyond the world of experience in a sphere of being that must be considered as metaphysical. So quite clearly, he discounted non-intrinsic values as, well, second class, whereas those proper values to which human life ought to be orientated were ultimately, by his own words, metaphysical ones. I suggest that here Rickert opened his philosophy widely to all sorts of ideological abuse, perhaps even offered willing support to the one German ideology that by 1932 was unmistakably in the ascendance. And his philosophy, in other words, needed no further Gleichschaltung in 1933. And I just mentioned here Bruno Bauch, who was a student of Rickert's, and he was even worse. I mean, he basically led the Nazi Philosophers Union. Anyway, so in short, I think Neurath's expression "Blubo Metaphysik" was more than justified. So when my thesis is here that the anti-exceptionalism of Neurath and Carnap, and here in a sense one can say the Vienna Circle as a whole, was motivated by opposition to what they perceived was ultimately, when you dig down what's at issue there, Plubo-Metaphysik. Right? Okay, now you may grant me this point, but you may also have a question now. And that is that, did Neurath and Carnap have an argument against the exceptionalist opposition that turns on more than the factual correspondence of meta-scientific position and political orientation? In other words, you may wonder by now, all right. Now, these exceptionalists, you pointed to Uebel here, Sombart, Spann, Scheler, und so weiter, Rickard, und so weiter. All these people, they were, hey, let's throw Heidegger in there. They were, of course, tarnished by their ultimately racist and undemocratic politics. But is that really necessary for exceptionalists to hold such a political view? What, isn't that a mere accident? Why did Carnap and Neurath? Isn't it possible to have a, as it were, a metaphysical conception of, to use that term, of social science that is not blubo, so to speak, that may be metaphysical, but is not, as it were, afflicted with this nasty politics? Well, next slide, please. I think they do have an argument, or rather, one can find an argument like that in Neurath and Carnap, in particular in Carnap there. So what is that? Let's have a look at it. Exceptionalists, we saw, hold that not only the roads to hypothesis formation are different in the human sciences, but also that the standards of hypothesis evaluation are different. What these different standards are remains often pretty unclear. We thought Sombart, Spann, Scheler, Rickard took social science and history to be affairs of the Geist, not to be profaned by demands of intersubjective testability. To hold this decisive, to think that this is decisive against exceptionalism, however, would be to beg the question against its claim to higher insight. But that would only be a good counter if that claim to higher insight were made good. If this can't be made good by empiricist standards, must anti-exceptionalists continue to beg the questions by saying, look, you're not empiricist enough, we are empiricists, so, So is it just a case of metaphysicians versus empiricists? Well, an independent argument seems to be required to show the preferability of anti-exceptionalism if we want to go that way. And now I would like to put forward the thesis that Carnap happened to supply precisely what's needed, and he did this with nothing else but his well-known principle of tolerance. Now, it is of course true that the principle of tolerance expresses empiricist sentiments, but it also does much more than that. It states a principle constitutive of rational discourse, i.e., discourse meeting the demands of scientific and generally clearly truth evaluable communication. Next slide, please. What does the principle of tolerance say? It says that for rational scientific discourse to be possible, participants must be prepared to explain their terms and the way they use their language to allow interlocutors to understand them and in principle assess the truth of their assertions. Thus, Carnap says, quote from Logical Syntax of Language, everyone is at liberty to build up his own logic, i.e. his own form of language as he wishes. All that is required of him is that if he wishes to discuss it, he must state his method clearly and give syntactical rules instead of philosophical arguments. Now, this principle of tolerance here is formulated clearly in a highly technical context, namely in the context of discussions about the foundations of mathematics, but it has much wider applicability. It has much wider applicability, especially if we replace, as Carnap would have did himself a few years later, the notion of syntactical rules by the notion of semantical rules and linguistic rules in general. Why does a principle of tolerance have such wider applicability? Well, it says there is not what it says. First of all, is that there's not just one correct true logic that underlies all languages, but he also says that's not needed for rational discourse either. Alternative logics and alternative languages being used, that would be no bar to rational discourse, as long, and that's the springende Punkt, as long as speakers explain their usage. So clearly, I think principle of tolerance generalizes beyond philosophy of logic and mathematics to philosophy of science as its most general, and beyond that, even to, one could say, rational public discourse at large. Next slide, please. Now, at this point, we might have a couple of worries, but I think these can be left aside. When Carnap here talks about what's needed for mutual understanding, he was not talking about perfect mutual understanding. The understanding that scientists share when they discuss scientific hypotheses is good enough, and likewise the everyday hermeneutics, the understanding that everyday hermeneutics is good enough, the everyday hermeneutics that we apply when we make sense of each other in our everyday business, right? A second point of worry might be, well, what about incommensurabilities between different linguistic frames and stuff? And there one can hold, I suppose, that these ultimately remain local and can be fenced in. We can designate these areas where two languages can't really be brought into congruence, and we can say, well, the concepts involved here are essentially contested. So if we adopt a moderate holism, then really incommensurability of the Kuhnian Feyerabendian kind of sort is not to be worried about much, I think. So what we've got then is that with the principle of tolerance, we can now see that our empiricists here are able to show the exceptionalists unable to meet the demands of rational scientific discourse without begging the question. Why can they do that? Well, they can show that the exceptionalists are unable to meet the demand that the principle of tolerance said, namely, tell me how you use your language, such that I can see whether I can make any sense of it, that I can know what would have to be the case if it were true, etc., etc. And you recall that I kind of earlier made the remark about debates about exceptionalism sometimes being highly specific, so that certain elements do not easily travel to other instances of the debate in other historical periods and geographical domains. And here, I think we have a very, very good case for that. Namely, I think the Neurath and Carnap have a really good argument with the principle of tolerance against the exceptionalists they were arguing against, namely the people like Sombart, Scheler, and Spann, all these people who basically used obfuscating metaphysics to promote a, well, amongst us, pretty reactionary, utterly reactionary political kind of philosophy, right? So if that's right, then here's another thesis. The lure of the unspecifiable otherness of the superior insight of Geisteswissenschaft, of not being confined by the shackles of conceptual thought or propositional form, that lure becomes precisely the undoing of that type of Geisteswissenschaften. So it faces, in the hands of these proponents, these opponents of Neuerding-Kahnemann, it faces, Geisteswissenschaften faces the following dilemma. If it can explain itself to the empiricists, then, well, then it's already part of unified science. If it can't explain itself to the empiricists, then, well, Geisteswissenschaften is uncheckable metaphysics. And the result, since Geisteswissenschaften does by its own admission, and happily admission, go metaphysical, it follows it's not a serious scientific contender by the standard set by the principle of tolerance. Next slide, please. What follows? What follows is, I think, that the principle of tolerance has a certain clarifying effect. It demonstrates that just as membership of the philosophers' club grants certain privileges, we can talk of Geist, vanishing ein smoke, etc. So scientific verificationism saves communicability of enterprises. We can even invoke old Wittgenstein here. Talk of inner processes stands in need of outer criteria. Note, by the way, that this verificationism here is a verificationism that does not try to explain the meaning or hold verification constitutive of meaning, but or of all criterion. Rather, it makes it criteria for meaningful discourse in fact based in scientific discourse. There are, as one might say, plenty of non-cognitive forms of discourse that human beings don't want to be without. So the verificationist criterion is a criterion that is used for discourses with a sense of rationality of assertion, like science. And one might say, ideally, it may apply to public political discourse too. So one can then ask, well, is this insistence on the demand of the principle of tolerance a political demand? Is this demand made by principle of tolerance not what an epistemic rationality demands that seeks to maximize transparency of discourse? Is it not simply a demand of scientific reason? One can answer, yep, it is, but this does not make it any less political, given certain circumstances, and in what type of circumstances it does. Even a simple demand for scientific reason can become political. We can see we've seen just now. Next slide, please. So the demand that discourse be maximally transparent has political consequences, for it forbids asymmetries of information and therewith of power between participants. In the political arena, it's essential to ensure accountabilities of holders of public office as well as private individuals whose activities impinge on the welfare of others. So maximality of transparency is at least immediate political demand, but in the 1930s, as we've seen, this demand also had a very specific political edge in the context of the episode of exceptionalism under discussion. All of them used Geisteswissenschaften, all the opponents we looked at used Geisteswissenschaften to legitimate undemocratic systems of states and integrated Geisteswissenschaft in Blubo, if you like. Of course, other episodes of the exceptional dispute show quite different distribution of politics among exceptionalists and anti-exceptionalists. And that's why we can't really generalize across all of them, all of these instances of the debate. Consider, for instance, the type of opponent of late 20th century, early 21st century exceptionalism. An illiberal Unitarian of science with reductivist intentions who recognizes or wishes to investigate only exceptionalist laws and is exclusively fixated on quantitative terminology, just like the logical positivists of popular imagination are, or in fact, from what one can gather, much of the 1950s social science in the United States actually was like. So that those, the conclusion I drew here do not hold for that. There, the political valence is, if anything, quite the opposite. Next slide, please. I always think the next slide says conclusion, but it's not yet. But we're getting there. We're getting there. So. Just a caveat, Neurath and Carnap did not quite put the general anti-exceptionalist argument as I did. It seems at least not explicitly, beyond charging exceptionalists with placing their assertions beyond testability in principle, that this violated the constitutive demand of scientific rationality, however, was obviously understood by them. Had they been pressed on why scientific rationality demanded that testability and principle be observed as a necessary conditions of scientific discourse, however, I do believe they would have answered as I've just characterized. The argument for maximal transparency readily follows from everything they stated and agitated for in their philosophy of science. Next slide, please. So here we come to the conclusion. At issue in the episode of the exceptional debate that Affair presented to you was not just a conception of science, but also a conception of human social being. Typically, this was presented as a philosophical dispute, Geisteswissenschaft versus plain empiricism, but it was also a political dispute. It was a political dispute because political philosophy was involved. Broadly, democratic versus authoritarian conceptions of state rule were evidently in the background, at least in the background here, but also because epistemology and philosophy of science can be, and in this instance, they were political. The focal point was the maximal transparency as a precondition of rational discourse. And given this focal point, the left Vienna Circle had, I think, quite a good point in arguing against their exceptionalist opposition. They were self-consciously political. But so were their opponents, interestingly enough. If one looks at them, they were quite happy to, exceptionalists were quite happy to denounce their opposition as well of a communist variety of sorts. But very last slide now, please. Okay. Many variations, I've said this enough. So in conclusion, one generalization, one take-home moral, although I've done that before. Generalization is that insofar as exceptionalism is committed to or tolerates, for one reason or another, non-transparency, I think we do well to remember the anti-exceptionalist argument of the logical empiricists. That seems to stand up rather well. The take-home message is that it would be unwise for contemporary exceptionalists to claim that all earlier exceptionalists were comrades for their cause. Some of the exceptionalist politics were as reactionary as can be, such that their agitation was utterly contrary to what appears to have moved the typical anti-positivist exceptionalist from the 1960s onwards. Thank you for your attention.
So, Professor Thomas Uebel, thank you for the very interesting presentation. We'll now begin the debate with Professor Marcos Silva, who will make some comments on it. So, Professor Marcos Silva, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning. Can you hear me? It's okay? Okay.
Yep, thank you.
Just testing my microphone here. Okay. The pity I cannot see the audience there and the people.
No, neither can I.
Yeah, so unfortunately, we just have the camera to me, so you can see the audience.
Can you turn the camera to the audience? No, it's not possible.
To do it, so that's a technical problem.
Yeah. Okay, no worries. Thank you, Bruno.
All right.
I like to see you too. You can stay there if you want.
Oh, okay, I can stay here. Yeah.
So I will not feel alone here. Okay, thank you for having me here, Porta, Mario Porta, good friend, and Bruno as well. Very nice work, Bruno, you're doing. Yeah. Thank you for everybody. And I always enjoyed to be there in São Paulo. I like very much to discuss with you people there in PUC São Paulo. I like much the discussions with the group of Mario Porta's group, but I'm very sorry for not being in person there in São Paulo this time. In fact, I mess up with the dates, but next time I will do right this. So keep inviting me, people. Just a correction. My paper this afternoon will be in English. I sent by. It was a mistake. I sent the text, the title in Portuguese, so it will be in English, so to be more accessible for everybody.
So actually, Professor Marcos, I already corrected on the folder that we. Yeah. So it's.
Bruno, you're so competent. Yeah. Thank you, guy. And concerning Uebel's paper, thank you very much, Professor Thomas Uebel. I enjoyed the paper, enjoyed reading the paper. I think it's a timely work. Just try to put this here in a different window so I can see Thomas Uebel from, while I see my remarks here as well. Okay, it's better now. So I think it's a much timely work, and it comes at the right moment, at least for us in Brazil. I think we are in a country suffering under an authoritarian government during the last years. During the pandemic, we had the worst president ever, at the worst time ever here for us. A president against science when people need science the most. So people were dying because of a disease that already had a vaccine. That is a big problem. It was a big problem for us, and is a big problem for us. A government which is against science, against universities, that supports misinformation, fake news, confusion, disorientation, this kind of dirty strategies that we see and this rise of the far right parties all over the world. And Brazil is suffering under that. So in a few weeks, we have one of the most important elections of our time here in Brazil, and 1/3 of our population still supports these far right people and parties here. So this is a pity. And Uebel's work, Thomas Uebel's work, deals with a recent past concerning democratic philosophers and authoritarian ones in Europe at the rise of a Nazi movement to the power there. Thomas Uebel shows us that philosophy can be taken as both as means for democratic ends, or also, unfortunately, for anti-democratic justifications of oppression and misuse of power. I think Uebel's work shows us that philosophy can be taken, can also show us that philosophy is not disconnected from politics as well. And Vienna Circle is a very nice example of that. It was a philosophical movement that sought to do away with metaphysics and pseudoscience in a city, in a country there darkened by fascism, anti-Semitism, and unreason. So the question here is how to use philosophy against an increasing far-right wave, especially when this far-right wave is supported by theological, metaphysical, and ideological justifications. So I read with kind of a heavy heart and a despair the following quote in Uebel's papers. He was quoting Voshoff, quoted in Marcuse. So Nazi theoreticians admitted this openly. An authoritarian government needs a justification that goes beyond the personal. The justification must be metaphysical. As a principle of state order, the distinction between leaders and led can be made only metaphysically, and that is a huge problem. So reading Uebel's, we see how, and unfortunately, why that history might repeat itself. And making another quotation here, maybe repeat itself as a tragedy and also as a force altogether here. So a thought came to my mind while I was reading Thomas Uebel's paper. I remembered Schlick, the leader, the philosopher, and how Schlick was killed by a far-right extremist on the university steps at that time. And here in Brazil, we are under attack. Things are bad in Brazil, but they can get worse. And that's the point. If you cannot react to this conservative, far-right philosophy and religion that's supporting this kind of government that we have. So it is important that the international community be aware of these two, and we need all possible help to stand up to racism, supremacists, and reactionary and undemocratic discourse. And thank you, Thomas Uebel, for the word here. So coming to Uebel's paper now, the paper is dealing directly to very interesting philosophical questions and issues and problems here. So, for example, what is social science and humanities? How to study our societies? What are the legitimate tools to do that? What is the methodological points we should do or have, and which ones we should avoid? What is the relation between the Geist and the natural? How to frame human societies, human sciences in comparison to natural sciences? What is the difference? What is common? Do they share a common methodology, shared principles, shared content? What is at issue here? Is the social science reducible to natural sciences? Which methodology should be accepted? What is legitimate here? What are the limits? And all the questions here have something to do directly or indirectly, as Thomas Uebel has shown us, with politics. It seems that we have a dilemma here, as he pointed out. So to be blind to certain phenomena is interpretation in hermeneutics, or conceptions of science or simply see too much and bring it into philosophy. So we have this kind of dilemma here: to see too much, or not really be able to see what is important here. In the Vienna case, investigating the exceptionalist opposition to logical empiricists, anti-exceptionalism, means investigating the politics that was prevalent in the intellectual scenario of the exceptionalists of the 1920s and 30s, as Thomas Uebel said. And testability is in the center of the debate here. Assertion that we can control were in the center of the debate as criteria for philosophy and politics. So we can avoid the ideological misrepresentations of social reality, and how this can be very close to metaphysical assertions. Are they immune to refutation? The philosophers should have a special intuitions somehow. Philosophers should see more than other people. This was easily transformed into an ideology of supremacy of German Geist, as Thomas Uebel presented, of a supposed depth of feeling and a special investigation of metaphysical realities. So this is the background here, and I would like to pose some. Actually, Thomas, I put in two groups of questions. The first one is dealing directly with the notion of rationality and testability, and the second group of questions I will pose some problems or maybe some discomfort with your reading of the principle of tolerance. Okay, so we have these two groups. So we have exceptionalists and anti-exceptionalists, as Thomas presented. This seems to be a dead end and has political meanings. How to deal with that? I think Thomas Uebel says in the middle of the paper that he's using a kind of methodology, using a continuum ranging from democratic to authoritarian views here. And he shows us at the end of his paper that we can be for anti-exceptionalism and also be a authoritarian as a narrow view of logical positivism can maintain or show to us. And I would like to maybe to think, Thomas, if you can see things in a different view here. Can we be exceptionalist and also democratic? I think this is possible, yeah. And that's the kind of point that I will bring up with the questions concerning rationality and testability here. So in your paper, I think there is a very close relation between testability and science. Yeah, no, and we can reframe it using the negation. So non-testability equals metaphysics. I think this the kind of direction of this maybe identification of equality here from metaphysics to non-testability is, I think it's okay. I think it's adequate. I have nothing against that. It comes also maybe from the definition of metaphysics that we have. That metaphysics, if we have metaphysics, we do not have testable propositions in a sense. But I would like to challenge a little bit this other direction of this equality here, which is if we have non-testability, that means, that entails metaphysics. I think there is a problem here. If you put at the end of your paper, you wrote, if Geisteswissenschaft can explain itself to empiricists, then it's already part of a unified science. If Geisteswissenschaft can explain itself to empiricists, then it can't explain. Then it is uncheckable metaphysics. I do not really agree with this point. I think there is a kind of false dilemma here, and I would like to develop a little bit in this direction. I think I have a problem with your paper about the meaning of testing or checking things. I think it's one of the central and crucial notions in your work here, but it was not precisely defined. And I was looking for a definition for that, because the way you're using is a little bit too vague, the notion of testability there. How to frame it as a criterion to be science if we do not really know what the specific meaning of what you calling what you hold for testability. When you say, I think there is a very important point here. How to check or test a social institution or propositions concerning social institutions, or a proposition concerning constitutions of a country, for instance. Are these things metaphysical? Are they testable? What is the sense of being testable here? And I would like to push a little bit further. What is the meaning of testing a logical principle, for instance, or logical vocabulary? Or in mathematics, are the propositions in logic and mathematics, are they testable? If they are not testable, are they metaphysical in a sense? I'm pretty much sure they are not testable as empirical assertions are. They are different. For instance, by the end of the paper, Thomas says, now Carnap and Neurath did not explicitly put the anti-exceptionalist argument, just as I did, beyond charging exceptionalists with placing their assertions beyond testability in principle. But again, what does it mean to be testable? That means directly testable, empirically testable, but to study a phenomena, phenomena are a phenomenon as consciousness, indirectly by behavior, that means being testable. And another way, concerning social structure, privilege, social recognition, exploitation, democracy, propositional concerning this kind of thing, they are testable. In which sense they are testable? How? They are empirically testable. I think non-empirically testable does not mean metaphysics directly. Qualia, for instance, are not directly testable, meaning that it's not intersubjective. Consciousness either. We can do science with norms and rules too. Rules and norms are not reducible to empirical evidence. As games, as institutions, as norms, as law, rules are intersubject, objective, very important for science, and do not need any metaphysical insight into reality, I think. And you say that exceptionalist move violate a constitutive demand of scientific rationality. And my question is why? I think science is built on more than empirical evidence and experimentation. Hypothesis elaboration, for instance, might be highly creative, and scientists need creative and insight too, just as artists sometimes. Much in science is built on analogies and analogical propositions. Analogical reasoning is testable. In which sense? Take mathematics and logic, for instance. How do we advance math by empirical testability? And logical systems by experimentation? How? I think after Gödel, for instance, we know that consistency of arithmetic is not tested or testable at all. Is mathematics metaphysics? It's not scientific. Is it not scientifically informed? It's not rational. I think it does not follow from this not testability that we have metaphysics here. We can have another kind of rationality here, I think. concerning rules and how to deal with them, and not how to test directly empirical truth. And the question is now how we verify rules. This is a role, I think this is a whole different normative enterprise here. And concerning, now is the second group, Thomas, of questions that I posed about your reading of the principle of tolerance as you read it. So this we are talking about the role of the principle of tolerance and the political use of the principle of tolerance. And I think there is more in your interpretation, Thomas, of this principle in your text than can be read in the principle itself. And you already said that, admitted that. I think Carnap is talking about formal languages and logic as formal systems. The principle of tolerance is about language, in a sense, and not really about semantics, in our view of semantics that we have nowadays. And it's not about testability itself or experimentation itself. I think it's about syntax and how to make sense of different possible languages, logics, and that means in terms of different syntaxes or syntactical rules. And I think that is the reason why today logical pluralists really love the principle of tolerance. Because they can really deal with different logical systems as dealing with games, because we have rules, syntactical rules, and we can manipulate and some signs. And we do not really to explore any kind of metaphysical interpretation of this multitude, this diversity of logical games or logical systems. So I do not really think that Carnap is talking about truth conditions, but about synthetical rules. This is important, different, if you take the exceptionalist view in logic. I think what we are dealing in logic, if we are dealing with logic, we are dealing with rules and not with truth. So rules should be tested differently, as they are not representations. So there is a sense in which the principle of tolerance undermines, and this, I think, reading the quote that you put in your slides in your paper, Carnap's quote, there is a sense in which the principle of tolerance undermines philosophical debate. It does not make room for philosophical informed debate. In a sense, this principle of tolerance does not really increase the philosophical debate. In a rough sense, if you take this prima facie stuff reading Carnap, what Carnap is saying there is, let's do not talk about philosophy. Show me the rules only. How come this formalist approach to language is a political approach or beneficial to philosophy? It seems it can be taken as the contrary. Carnap, in a sense, is dismissing philosophy there, or philosophical debates there. When they say, let's not talk about philosophy, just give me the rules and we calculate it. So liberty is good. It also allows for plasticity of the logical systems. It may have a larger political meaning as well, but it's a larger door for conventionalism and arbitrariness. I think we need some constraints in this principle of tolerance there. One of the criticism that Thomas Uebel presented against the metaphysical point of view is the kind of openness. It's too open to wherever people want. It can be arbitrary. So the question here is also, don't we have this kind of openness and arbitrariness that should be avoided in metaphysics, again, with this use of the principle of tolerance? I think what we are missing there is that meaning is normative, but not in the sense of being arbitrary or purely conventional, but in the sense that has to do directly with our, and that here is my Wittgensteinian view, has to do with our form of life, with our history, with our communities, and our institutions, and maybe our natural history as well. I think there are some limitations to this principle. And these limitations are, again, given by communities and these institutional pressures as well. Okay, thank you very much, Thomas Uebel. I enjoyed very much reading your work. And thank you, Bruno and Mario Porta as well.
Thank you. Okay.
So, Professor Uebel, yeah, you can comment on it if you want.
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much for your comments. I do appreciate the your appreciation of the reminder that this paper gives of the political dimension that some purely formal or philosophy of science can have, which you said at the beginning. And I think that is something that is indeed too often overlooked. But turning straight to your two questions, you first ask, well, testability, yes. If no testability, then it's metaphysics. Well, is that you wondered whether this is a false dilemma? Well, what I've used metaphysics when I've used metaphysics here, I've used it in the way precisely Neurath and Carnap used it, namely that metaphysics, that questions of a claim is made for something to be either true or false, and yet there is absolutely no way of deciding whether what is being claimed to be true or false is true or false. So that was that. I take that understanding of metaphysics. Now, and you're saying, so, well, of course, but just because we can't test certain propositions doesn't mean that it's sort of metaphysics. And, well, the understanding that goes with this principle, no testability, then metaphysics, is, of course, that this is restricted to empirical science. I mean, that goes without saying. I mean, if I didn't say it, I assumed everybody would understand it. So the question of how do we test logic or mathematics is really, if you don't mind me saying, a little bit besides the point. That was precisely the point of Carnap's to draw the distinction, which he later was much attacked by Quine, Goodman, etc., the distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. So but propositions of logic and mathematics can be shown to be meaningful if they can be shown to follow from a given set of axioms plus rules plus definitions and kind of stuff. But there is, of course, no empirical testing for mathematics or for logic, right? I grant you that, but that was obviously that was not intended. With regard to the testing of rules, well, there I would have to, as it were, return to you with a question and saying, well, what do you mean with testing? How do we? What are we testing when we are testing rules? whether we should adopt them, then this is a normative question, which I'm not sure that this falls. Certainly, it doesn't fall under in the domain for which testability as a criterion of scientificity, if I can use that terrible word, be used, because that is not devising normative rules for behavior. I would say is not a job of empirical science. So in that sense, testability was not for that. If we think of testing rules as saying, well, is that the rule in an empirical sense, in as much as we're saying, is that the rule according to which people behave in this and this society? Well, then we have a straightforward empirical proposition, namely the proposition that people in society XYZ or in situation XYZ or what have you behave in these and these fashions, and that is about as empirical a claim as as raining today or not, whatever, given in a certain location. So that can be tested. As to whether normative claims should obtain or not, I don't think that was ever within the realm of intended realm of testability, right? And now that's so we can put logic and mathematics and as it were substantive norms to the side. What you do raise the question, well, how do we test assertions about social phenomena? And I think you're right, absolutely right, to say that this is not a straightforward matter. But nevertheless, whether we may not be able to test it in a direct way, but there must be certainly, if the principle says if we claim for a certain claim to be true, say that in I don't know, in a certain that in a certain society, a certain group is underprivileged, if we say that, then we have to show. Then obviously we have to provide evidence for it. Then we have to define how we have to define what we mean by privileged and underprivileged, and then we have to bring statistical evidence, etc., and that sort of thing. So I don't think that apart from the difficulty of providing evidence for assertions, for factual assertions about social phenomena, that they are outside the realm of testability in principle, either immediately, roundabout, etc., kind of stuff. And of course, forget certainty. I take it for granted we're talking fallibilism here, right? So I'm a bit embarrassed, but this understanding of testability is pretty basic, so basic that Carnap and Neurath even shared it to a large extent with Popper. But it just goes to show that it's a fundamental kind of insight. So I don't really see the problem once we delimit the thing clearly. As to your question about the principle of tolerance, well, it's of course, as I said, in Carnap, applied it in the first place to discussions about, well, in the discussions about the foundations of logic, etc. And when he says, look, you can have alternative logic. So it was his probably he wasn't the very first of it. There was, Karl Menger worked in a similar direction, but he sort of challenged the idea that there was one underlying logic that underlay all languages and was, presupposed by all human communication. And he kind of said, as he said, everyone is at liberty to build up their own language, his own form of language as they wish. And then he says, all that is required, if he wishes to discuss it, he must state his method clearly and give rules. So in other words, as I said, what Carnap says here is, have your own logic, have your own language, have your alternative forms of expression, fine. But communication, if you want to communicate using these forms, you have to let people know how you use your language. And it's clearly, as I said, this is an extension of the original use of Carnap made in there, but I think it's an extension of the original principle that is not at all forced and quite obvious. Because precisely what the quote unquote metaphysical opposition to in the 20s and 30s did was, indulge in utterly sort of obscure language and obfuscation, etc., etc. One could not do that. So I agree with you. It's an extension, but then that's what I said in my paper. It's an extension for that, but it is an extension that allows, so to speak, the principle of that it allows a certain principle of rationality that is so to speak operative in science, namely that if I make a truth claim, I have to bring up evidence for it. I have to be accountable for it, and that evidence has to be intersubjectively accessible. Right? It's basically if the principle of tolerance links up with this basic principle of scientific rationality very well. Namely, it says in order that it links up that the accessibility, intersubjective accessibility to evidence is, of course, only given if how I present the evidence is given in clear language. So it is one of the preconditions for that. So the condition Carnap gives for discussing alternative logics holds equally for the discussion of, I don't know, novel findings in science or in new disciplines or what have you, kind of stuff. So I take it I take it to really be that more widely acceptable, and I can't really see why Carnap should object to this. If you look at throughout, I mean, Carnap's own, I mean, you mentioned well, principle of tolerance says, look, let's not have philosophy. Let's just discuss languages and how we can express ourselves. So one can translate, and I think there is definitely a strong element of that in Carnap and how he uses the and how it bears, or the principle of tolerance sort of bears on that. It's what has been sometimes called Carnap's explicationism. What for Carnap remains of philosophy is basically the ability to analyze languages, analyze ways of expression, analyze attempts to justify knowledge claims, and on the other hand, for his logic of science, to explore alternative languages, explore alternative ways of expressions. And that can mean, of course, that we look at what has been called contested concepts. and we say X concept freedom, take the concept of, I don't know, freedom or liberty or something. Liberty means this, no, liberty means this. And one person comes with a positive conception of negative liberty, another negative conception, another person comes with a Republican conception of liberty, and there's a some kind of Babylonian confusion. And what Carnap says here, no, that this is where the philosopher can come in. We can formalize a small, and as it were, we can produce a little island of formalized language, and then say, well, if I mean the concept in this way, then it has these and these entailments, and we can build that into the meaning postulates for that in this way. And if you mean the concept in another way, it comes in that way, and then we can see how that coheres with other concepts we use or might want to use. So the language constructor aspect of Carnap is indeed a very deflationary approach to philosophy. I totally agree, but that is all totally in line with reading the principle of tolerance as making certain demands on the language we use in attempts to that the principle extends to demands we reasonably make on attempts to communicate with one another about factual matters. And so in that sense, so I think I'll leave it at that point. Thank you, but thank you very much for your engaging comments on that.
Can I make just a remark, a bit on it's possible, and then open for the audience.
And we'll open to the question session.
Yeah. Just a comment, Thomas. We really know that this analytical and synthetical distinctions is a dead end. Yeah. There is something okay.
I think this is one of the reasons why philosophy is still interesting.
Yeah,
because we don't know. There are Quine and company have produced some excellent arguments, but they are not by no means conclusive.
Yeah, it's not conclusive, it's controversial. Yeah?
And it becomes quite common in that context to.
I think in this my reading of your paper, I was trying to figure out this a possibility to be an exceptionalist.
Oh yeah, I should tell. Yeah, can I just address?
Also democratic there.
Can I just address that point?
And the phenomenon that I'm trying to point out is that if we are talking about rules, and rules is pervasive about the social phenomena, also about logical systems as well, maybe we can have this kind of hint to where we go, talking about normativity and trying to see the normativity. We can reframe this exceptionalist point of view, trying to see normativity as a kind of, no problem, normativity as a good argument for an exceptionalist. Because we bring
we've heard it yesterday from Professor Brandom. Indeed, yeah. Yes, I know. But the question is, first of all, how do we? Well, two things. First of all, you raised the question: can one be an exceptionalist and be of a democratic kind of mindset? And I said so in the paper. Yes, of course you can. I mean, that's precisely why I made the song and dance of saying, look, this is a particular episode, and however, it mustn't be forgotten, but we can't generalize. And that's precisely why, towards the end of the paper, I pointed to the typical anti-exceptionalism that has arisen ever since the 60s, which went against the the illiberal, what I call the illiberal unity of science people, who said, well, look, if you want sociology to be a science, give us universal laws, give us this, be quantitative all over. We mustn't have any qualitative terminology and so on. So of course you can be exceptionalist and democratic with regard to, but the opposition that Neurath and Carnap had obviously was not. But as regard to rules and normativity, well, yes, but now I have to ask you the question. Again, although I may have said it before, if we're concerned with rules in the question of shall we adopt them? Well, shall we adopt them? This is a little bit like constructing a language. Shall we speak in this way or not? And that indeed is, you use the term language science can be created. Well, in that respect, the minimalist, deflationist philosopher that Carnap has become can be creative. He's saying, look, why don't we speak in this fashion or in that fashion, and that kind of stuff. And then what he gives for it, he of course needs to give reason why it would be good to speak that way. And you can say, well, it has this benefit, it has this disadvantage, but these benefits seem to overweigh the other benefit. But again, this is a question of what should be the case or what we should do. I don't think anybody ever thought that was a question of empirical testability either. And those questions as to the normative, what should, of course, when we talk about society, normative questions are never far away. But typically, I don't think one has to be a total Weberian to think that typically social science, even social science, is not in the job of saying how society should be organized. That would be social philosophy or political philosophy or what have you, right? But rather, it's in the business of telling us how society operates. And it can be, we can approach that with our values, and we're interested in this because of that, and da. But it's, as long as science, as long as it's empirical science, it deals with facts, whether what is the case. Now you may say, oh God, Uebel, he's really a positive. Not only does he believe in analytic synthetic, or fancy he could go on believing it if he comes up with a decent argument against Quine, but he also draws a distinction between descriptive and normative. Yes, I do. So, but that's a different paper now. So, but anyway, does that engage with what your worries are?
I'm looking forward to read your paper on description and normative propositions. This
something like that, yeah.
After reading your paper, and also I didn't really thought about this kind of a discussion about exceptionalism in this frame of the Vienna Circle thing, but concerning the talk about logic and how this can be normative, and also how this dealing with also social sciences, also forms of lives, I think I must say that I have an inclination to exceptionalism.
Well,
and I'm democratic.
Yes, I know. Well, we've done this point, so that's fine. And hey, in many points, and after that, I think Bruno wants to open up the discussion more widely. So I'll just make one more point. In many ways, I mean, the anti-exceptionalist in chief was, of course, Neurath, right? But when you look at what his, and this is a point that maybe I can stress here to conclude this part of the discussion. Yes, it's a point. When you look at Neurath's conception of the unity of science, how pluralistic and varied that in itself already is, and how anti-reductionist, etc., etc. In many ways, that gives you a lot, maybe not all, but gives you perhaps already most of what, quote unquote, reasonable anti-exceptionalism might want. But we'll leave it there. Thank you. Thank you again for your comments. Stimulating. Very stimulating.
Thank you both for the discussion. We'll now open the question session, and we have here with us Professor Peter Simons and Professor Mark Dexter. So first and foremost, I would like to know if any of you have a question. Do you have it, Peter Simons? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and
Good.
clear.
Thank you, Thomas. That was very enlightening. I have one very small historical question and one slightly wider but waffly material question. The historical question is whether Sombart's idea of revealing Geist in history, whether that comes in any way directly or indirectly from Hegel. And the second question is, I like the idea of using, well, let's say broadly testability or understandability as a stick with which to beat people who refuse to engage in debate and thereby uphold what we might call intolerant values. And I think that can be used against intolerance of the left as well as intolerance of the right. So I'm slightly less pessimistic than you are that your general strategy that you discovered is not applicable to, let's say, a wider range of cases, if not all cases, of people trying to block anti-democratic, intolerant discourse and activity. That's it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. With the first one, whether Sombart got Geist in history, well, that sounds very Hegelian. It could. I'm not sure where Sombart got it. I mean, he could also have it from Ranke, because after all, Ranke saw the finger of God in history. So it was a certain. I take that to be sort of a standard trope of sort of idealist philosophy of history in, going back in the 19th kind of century. Your question about testability, well, I certainly agree that it sort of, and I'm very happy to hear that you agree to it as well, that this testability could be used, as you put it, as a stick to beat intolerant, the defense of intolerant sort of position with, and that goes that this goes against intolerance on the left, not only on the right. I totally agree with. I mean, we don't have to be, but there are certain aspects of identity politics that remove claims from intersubjective testability, and it's precisely because of that in certain institutional settings they become extremely problematic. So that is one thing. So, but when you said, "Oh, I'm pessimistic," well, I did not I did not actually mean to be pessimistic about, so to speak, making testability as a yardstick of intersubjective accountability, so to speak. I would like to, kind of see this to sort of be used widely. Sort of my, as it were, let's not take it too far, was meant basically to generalize too far from the, as it were, conclusions about what exceptionalists are and how they argue from the particular argument I used from the 20s and 30s. So as I also pointed out to Marco, when you turn it around at the in the late 20th century, typically it was the exceptionalists who sort of argued for a more liberal conception of science and a less restrictive conceptions of sociology, blah blah blah, that kind of stuff. So that's what I had in mind. But as for testability, I mean, you might even call me a Popperian for that, which of course is very embarrassing for a Neuratian, but no, I totally agree with it. That seems as good a stick to use for that as one could find. Thank you.
So, Professor Texter, do you have a question? You want to ask something?
Maybe a quick question, just the gist of the paper. So, do you? I mean, it seems to me you don't think that exceptionalism in general is a bad thing, or is it? There are certain views of varieties of exceptionalism which are politically, metaphysically loaded. But as I think you responded to Marcos, it looks like there are completely neutral versions of politically, maybe even metaphysically neutral version of exceptionalism, which only say, look, when it comes to understanding beings like us, we have a form of gaining knowledge of what's going on with them, which is different from mere sense perception, maybe empathy.
If the answer to this would be that if it's let's put it if you think that knowledge claims derived from the use of empathy are ultimately open to indirectly and highly fallible, blah 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 blah, are sort of ultimately open to some kind of investigation in the testing as to whether the claim is true or false, then I think by the taxonomy, so to speak, by the Neuratian taxonomy, so to speak, that I'm using here, that's not exceptionalism anymore.
Yeah, I would.
You see, that would, because if you, as I put it, embarrassingly crudely, if you can test it, fine, it's part of unified science. However immediately, if you can't, well, look, whatever it is, it may be art, great, love it, but that kind of stuff. So,
can I think your modus ponens is perhaps my modus tollens. So I would say that we need to refine this classification, because it looks to be there's a distinctive form of understanding living things. Yeah.
Understanding
living things. That's how
living things. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Before lots, and so how they characterize it as there are forms of that matter.
Yeah.
Things, other things.
That's
it's not saying something like inviting metaphysics or thereby taking all these kind of assumptions on board.
Well, that's
another thing, but maybe we can carve it up in a way that it belongs to the learning in general or science in general. But we have a distinctive link to other things like us. That's, I think, the exceptionalist minimalism, minimal position.
Yeah, well, and I mean, what I can say to that is fine if a position like that wishes to consider itself exceptionalist, Okay, but then what the exceptionalism means, it's we are different in certain respects from the natural sciences.
Yeah.
Well, nobody denies it, and this is the point. This is a background against which my whole argument is. Neurath didn't deny that. I mean, that's the whole. I mean, as I mentioned in passing, Neurath was a trained historian. He was. He studied August Beck, one of the guys who invented. I mean, there's various claims for people who invented the hermeneutic circle, but one of them goes back to Beck and kind of stuff. So he's familiar with what I call everyday hermeneutics, and he himself I had this early on. I had this kind of quote. He said, when the concept of verstehen is analyzed scientifically, then everything about it that can be communicated in words to somebody else turns out to be a statement about structure. Well, that's funny jargon again, but never mind. At that point, anything that was meaningful was a statement about structure. That was 28, 29 type sort of thing. So we can leave that. So that was Neurath's thing. Then yeah, of course they're different, but that doesn't mean that they are.
It has room in this pluralistic.
Absolutely, yes.
Question: when does this kind of view turn bad, and how are there any arguments by the later guys like Sombart or so, which take you from the distinctive source of knowledge about beings like us to all this kind of stuff about whatever, family, blah, blah, and this kind of what you call blue, or what they call blue ball.
Yeah.
Where's this loaded into exceptionalism?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question.
I mean, do these guys give? I mean, there's this kind of very minimal position. It's just there's a source of knowledge for things like us. Which,
the blue ball guys don't have the minimalist position. If that's
where does this other stuff come from? I mean, is it an argument, or is it just kind of? Is that what? Ideology.
Well, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's I think the Rickert stuff is, God knows. He became more extreme as he became older. But there is this. I mean, Dilthey in many ways starts this business with a understanding on the one side, verstehen on the other. And he makes what you might say a bigger epistemological deal out of it than should be, and then increasingly, of course, then Windelband had a somewhat similar idea with ideographic sciences versus generalizing nomothetic sciences and that kind of stuff. But of course, what's his name? Windelband was a sort of a Kantian of a particular type, whereas Dilthey wasn't. So they had to differentiate each other from that. So Windelband sort of hit upon, in particular, the value aspect, which is not all that strong, I think, in Dilthey, which is a little bit more methodological. And then basically Rickert went with it and sort of hyposted it wasn't just values that we hold, but these values. In other words, Dilthey already had with this idea that no, understanding is not like erklären, so all the testing falls away. We can't test reasons, so how do we test what? How can you get objectivity in there? And somehow, having brought in values with throwing values into the mix with Windelband, then one way of getting objectivity into this understanding was, I suppose, to postulate these values to have objective reality and to claim that the values that I suppose our actions embody or do not embody, or that we aspire to or not aspire to, and blah blah blah, have some kind of relation to those, as Rickert, very openly says, metaphysical, entities. So that's, I mean, there is a lot of Deutsche Geistesgeschichte as well there, which has to do with the, the long way of the verspätete Nation. But that we can leave that alone now.
Okay.
Does that help a bit?
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, does anyone from the audience has any questions? Okay. So, I think that's it for today. Yeah. I would like to thank both Professor Thomas Uebel and Professor Marco Silva for joining us and accepting the invitation. I would also like to thank both Professor Peter Simons and Professor Mark Dexter for joining. Okay, so we unexpectedly have one question from the audience. So, just a second.
Hey, hi, Lucas. Thank you for the talk. So I was just wondering, in his England days, Neurath actually wrote several times about it. And
Fala
are you hearing me well?
Fala alto e
Okay, so and he would this big criticism of Platonistic German education and how Platonic tradition was raised upon the various types of textbooks that are used to raise.
I cannot hear. Oh, okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, but it breaks up sometimes. It's sort of intermittent.
Okay, so if anything happens, just tell me. I'll repeat myself. Okay.
Yeah.
So in his late years, in his England time, so Neurath starts to write about and actually engage in several correspondences with other authors about the problem of Platonistic education in Germany.
Ah.
So he writes about it several times, and you think this criticism of anti-exceptionalism eventually leads to his criticism of Platonists in general, as being around metaphysics for social sciences and pedagogy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that suggestion. That is indeed very very fitting, because that thereby you link to bring other people maybe in I think in 1944, 45, anyway, towards the end of his life, towards the end of the Second World War, Neurath was much engaged in questions about, well, basically the re-education of Germans and Austrians after the war into, getting them and he was also puzzled with what worried about what made it possible for this catastrophe that Nazism, the realm of Nazism, was the rule of Hitler, etc. And he adopted the one of the theses that he adopted was that in traditional German education, certain Platonic ideals were very much upheld, and the Platonic ideals were like, for instance, in the Republic, that what he was, so kind of stuff, and it's it did not just have to do with the fact that, as it were, the Platonic third realm and kind of stuff, but also certain ideas of how society was to be organized, etc., etc. But what Neurath in any case found is that typically in the more or less classical German education, in the gymnasium and the high schools, not necessarily in the Volksschule, which just doesn't go that far, but that in the classical German education, these Platonic ideals were very much venerated and upheld, and he opposed that strongly, and in doing so prompted a furious reaction by some British classicists who kind of claimed that this was to misunderstand Plato, etc., etc. But what they kind of failed to understand was precisely the, so to speak, cultural political value that these Platonic ideals had in this German education. And I think you're absolutely right that the Neurath's argument against that is very much, very, very similarly motivated as his argument against the exceptionalists, sort of at that point 10 years earlier in the Vienna Circle. Yeah, but thank you for pointing out that parallel. That's great. Yeah.
Okay. So we have one more question, Professor Uebel.
No, I'll just take that.
What?
That works, huh?
Yeah, but it is not good for them. So they do not
Use this one?
No. Just speak loud to the camera.
This camera.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for the talk and also for the discussion. My question would be about, addressing the whole Vienna Circle. You have, don't get me wrong, but you have kind of addressed only the obvious figures, namely Neurath. And what I would be interested, what do you think about anti-exceptionalism in Moritz Schlick? Because you probably know Moritz Schlick.
Schlick, oh yeah, Moritz Schlick, yeah, okay.
Because I was a little bit engaged in reviewing the new volumes of the Moritz Schlick Gesamtausgabe, and they're publishing all these lectures about, he was really engaged into what he called Kulturphilosophie. So I would be very interested if you have a meaning about Moritz Schlick when it comes to anti-exceptionalism.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. In fact, I had the original paper has a footnote somewhere saying that whether Schlick agreed with Neurath in all respects on the anti-exceptionalism is another question that will not be dealt with, and I'm not sure I've already read, because there's quite a few just came out in the last year or two, I think, of these Schlick things, and I'm not sure I've read the thing on the Kulturwissenschaft there yet. But Schlick was, how shall we say, less militant than, certainly, well, it's a tautology. Schlick was less militant than Neurath, but he had certain sympathies for the exceptionalist, insofar as he took it, at least with regards as history is concerned, because he took it that there are turns of phrase actually already in the paper that was published in 34, or 32, but was written much earlier, was where he briefly discusses the exceptionalism, and he kind of characterizes their history as a discipline that, well, is less interested in conveying. These are my words now. Right? Is less interested in conveying facts than oh God, I'm nearly turning into then in allowing us to share proxy in forms of life that are not ours. This is now very badly put, and on the one hand, I put it too closely to certain forms of anthropologists, like or something. But in any case, Schlick had certain sympathies for the exceptionalist side, which were not shared by Neurath. And in that sense, I tried to make sure that that the logical empiricists I talk about were predominantly Neurath and Carnap. And I mean, Schlick it would be interesting to see precisely how far Schlick went over to the other side. I don't think he ever did, but it's interesting enough that one of the comments in correspondence where Neurath uses the term Blubo Metaphysik is in a comment in a letter to Carnap, where he complains about Schlick, making precisely allowances for history that it has more to do with allowing us some form of Erleben that we normally wouldn't have, instead of giving us, well, factual knowledge. And he kind of says, oh my God, there is Schlick. It was precisely at the height of his dispute with Schlick over also, well, I think the unprintable or unprinted first volume of Empirical Sociology. So there was little sympathy between the two at that point anyway. And he complained to comment, see, that's where it begins. This is, wehret den Anfängen. This is so yes, that's true. There is a variety here that sort of a longer paper would have to address. Yes, thank you for pointing that out.
So, yeah, so the camera is not. So, yeah. So, thank you for the discussion and the question posed. Thank you, Professor Uebel and Professor Marco Silva, for joining us here today and accepting our invitation. Thank you for Professor Peter Simons and Professor Mark Textor for being our guests here. And I would like also to thank all of you who watched us, either on the audience here presentially at São Paulo or in YouTube. So that's it for today. As I said yesterday, throughout the event, we are just broadcasting the morning sessions, so we're not broadcasting the afternoon and evening sessions. If you are in São Paulo, you can come in the afternoon to watch Marco Silva's presentation and also André Leclerc's. And if you only watch us in YouTube, I'll see you tomorrow. Yeah. Okay. So thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.